Bam.
This is Ejaz Malikzada, and you're watching Breaking It Down show.
That's right.
Yeah,
And
bits.
we also have with Scott Richards. Hey, Scott.
Had a few technical issues getting started.
We don't
Hey,
mind
Scott.
technical issues. So Ejaz,
been a while.
It has been.
Yeah, we're gonna all get caught up here live on the show. Ejaz is a tremendously unique individual. He is born and raised in Afghanistan, has worked deep within the government and all around it. By the way, the guy below me, Scott, is equally qualified to talk about this stuff and has legitimate working for the Afghan government. We're talking about the previous government, the GIRoA, the Islamic government of Afghanistan. So what we're talking about today is, I guess, fellas, one of the things that I want to talk about is what was working, what wasn't, and then, as always, we want to look forward. So forward to Afghanistan, and also forward to, let's just be critical here for a second. Secretary Clinton announced that there's going to be this aid organization that she's standing up to help the Ukrainians get back up on their feet, which I look around and I go, like, haven't we done this before? You know, like, I mean, is this the organization we want doing this, and what have we learned? So I'd like to kind of cover some of this. And Scott, because you know Ejaz so well, and you guys have both worked within the government, I just want to have you guys talk about what we don't have a sense for this here in America. What was working? You know, late in the game, in the 2020s, what was working in Afghanistan in terms of when I was there in 2012, right? You couldn't reliably get a request for support to go out to the outlying districts. If you weren't anywhere near the ring route, you weren't going to get anything to come down, whether it was stopped by an American or stopped by someone in the Afghan government. So from what I saw, there was no government out in the hinterlands. But maybe that's not true in Kabul or in Kandahar. I don't know. So what were your guys' experiences in working with the government? Was there a government that you guys could see and see function?
I'll let Scott go first.
Okay.
Yeah.
What I saw was a Kabul-centric government with, some presence and capacity in places like Herat and Mazar-Sharif. But when, and at various times you saw effort and momentum from the GIRoA side, and I work exclusively on the GIRoA side, so it's not part of the RS mission or anything else like that. But to try to do things, in and around frameworks that we had like SMAF, which was basically self-reliance, they were only ever given a lot of verbiage and demand to sort of be done as objective by, by the West, by the donor countries, by ISAF, by RS. But there was really no substance. So anytime you try to bring something from the GIRoA side, it wouldn't get any support because I think functionally the problem was that it didn't feed as much into the contractor-led financing structures that were designed. And unless you were in the hand of a prime, you didn't really have any option. And those primes themselves enabled corruption because they always had interest in the contracts and being the incumbent. And in terms of what you said about access to profits, you sit in countless meetings reviewing progress on initiatives, and you'd be told by the various entities that were supposed to be doing activities, oh, we couldn't get there, we couldn't build this road or this bridge, we couldn't do this because there's no security. But there was no penalty for that. And whenever you tried to reach out, whether that was justice, counter narcotics, whether that was to contest smuggling of money, because these things were heavily reliant on resources, you wouldn't get any. I mean, when I went into one of the most important justice offices, in Afghanistan, the Attorney General's office, they didn't have computers and nothing. And so these, billions of dollars are spent on the justice sector, and they had nothing, absolutely nothing. They had less than nothing. Desks were used where people could cook lunch because they didn't even have anything really to work with. So this idea that, it was just GIRoA that was burning money just wasn't there. But, to my experience, and Ejaz will be able to talk a lot more about, some of the other stuff than I can, was that after the second election with Abdullah, Ghani really closeted himself away. And so certain parts of government were much less accessible, but that was also not an irrational decision entirely, because it was kind of a hostile setting in some respects. But the whole situation is just a myriad of disasters, and to touch on whereas we'll lead with your other question later on, is that we absolutely don't want to be doing aid, NGO-led, development with a country like Ukraine. But we'll talk about that in a bit.
Well, I would start with the question of what was working and what was not working. Whatever it was, we had a some sort of functional government that was built. The foundation of it was not put right, and then we were sitting on a very shaky infrastructure. And the reason I call it shaky was that everything that was done in the country was something that was not coming from within Afghanistan. Everything was imported. We brought these NGOs, contractors, UN, and all these people, paying consultants, whoever out there, to build projects, to write projects and just check, objectives, goals, activities, outcomes, resources, all just check, and just money spent on God knows whatever. At the end of the day, at the end of the year, you just see, okay, did I do this? Yes, this activity for this project was done. This much budget was spent on it. Yes, the same thing. EU, the US government, USA, UN. These were not Afghan ideas. These were not, we did not, anything that was done in the country was not, to institutionalize what's in the text, in the laws, or in the books. It was just to something to implement on the surface. What's beneath was never taken into consideration. So we had media, we had girls going to school, we had freedom, whatever it was. Everything was what was beneath was never touched. Like, at the end of the day, coming to the what was, Scott mentioned corruption. I dealt a lot with doing research, using whistleblowers on how corruption was, how people were able to get large sums of money from projects, from customs, from here and there, from everywhere. Basically, half of the revenues of the country was taken. So we had something on the surface, and then we had, which was what we call a government. But when we had another parallel government there, that was a corrupt government. So everything here, there was something matching it, that was a corrupt parallel government. So basically, like I would give you an example. I don't know if time permits, I would give you examples from what happened in the Afghan customs. like I've shared it with Scott in the past. I've shown videos of how things are done. How half of the revenues from like billions of dollars annually is looted from the Afghan customs, and I think the same foundation that was put there, that allowed corruption, it's still ongoing. A few months ago, the EU was claiming that the Taliban are able to make millions of dollars from the customs and there's no corruption. It's wrong, because I have been in touch with people in the customs. It's the same thing. So so things were working. As long as you have money, as long as you throw money at anything, it works. As soon as it runs out of money, it collapses. That's what happened with the Afghan army. So they built something with the support, of the NATO and the US. We had an army, but that was very much, relying on the US government. And then as soon as they pull the rug under their feet, it's gone. It collapsed in the matter of 24 to 48 hours.
Let me. I don't want to get too far past this, because you're talking about important aspects, and I do want to bring it into the modern time. We know that the corruption. So in Ukraine, it is a corrupt country. They're doing what they can to try to curb that. There are also a lot of successful business people, and how they got to that success, I guess we could discuss that as well. But there are people that know how to do things. What seems to happen, and you talked about the base of the Afghan structure for the government and how it wasn't founded in reality. I see the same kind of situations, different scenario, but when you bring in the American or the Western solution into the Ukrainian problem, do either of you see problems ahead in terms of corruption? I mean, if it's customs, or the state stealing, look, we see it already happening. The state takes over businesses. I don't know if you guys are aware of this in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, and they'll say, "Hey, you guys are corrupt," and then the state doesn't know how to run it, and then they're like, "Hey, by the way, can you guys come back and run this business for us again, this refinery, this factory?" And so there's all this overturn, and they just kind of stumble along. So when you see this, do either of you have any faith that the U.S.-led efforts to, and again, let's echo, the U.S. and the West are funding this military machine for Ukraine, right? And it's doing well. You pull that support away, and then how quickly does it crumble? So do either of you have faith that we won't see the same situation where there's going to be a ton of corruption funded by the West and its desire to stabilize, or will this just be the same thing we saw in a different version in Afghanistan? And I guess, Ejaz, I'll ask you to go first. Do you see the same hallmarks? Would you say it's different? What are your thoughts?
In Ukraine, is the U.S. or the NATO or the whole world, the West, dealing with Ukraine via contractors, or is it a direct aid, to the Ukrainian government? That's a question. If they are dealing, via through a channel of contractors, then that's where things go wrong, because contractors started. It all started with contractors. The corruption, and all these contractors that are based in the West, in the U.S. and Europe. I heard from friends working with the WFP, World Food Program, and they're distributing. Regarding the distribution of aid to Ukrainians, and how they do it, they're handing out cash. Handing out cash to people for food did not work in Afghanistan. It's not going to work in Ukraine. It's not a sustainable solution. you're not gonna, be able to help people by giving them cash. Again, going back to like, and they are doing that through contractors. This was done in Afghanistan through contractors. There was, I have many examples of UN working through contractors who have, wasted money or taken money to their own pockets instead of giving the money to the local beneficiaries. So again, so if they're going through contractors, things are not going to go the way they should go. The same thing happened in Afghanistan. And again, another example of how things can go wrong is, I remember Afghanistan was requesting the U.S. government to give them air, capability, training, and equipment. They were not given any of those equipment. What type of equipment does Ukraine get? Are they getting what they need or what they're requesting? I've seen many speeches by President Zelensky and other Ukrainians, and they're saying we need this and this and this. What do they have? Russia uses thermobaric bombs. That's nothing. There's nothing there's nothing provided to Ukraine to counter that. Do they have that capability? I don't know. Probably Scott has more information on that. So what they need versus what they are provided, probably what they are getting is not, the sort of weapons and, the sort of capability that they want. And if they are given certain equipment, they don't have training for it. Same thing happened in Afghanistan. They were given aircrafts that they didn't know how to use them, or they didn't have training for. And that's how, we were not able to, in certain ways, to combat Taliban terrorists. Back to you,
Scott.
So Ukraine is a slightly different conflict from the ground up, which changes the dynamics. Because you've got a nation-state invader coming in, and so that coheses a country's position much more effectively. Whereas the Taliban, in part are an indigenous movement, but another part are backed by Pakistan, and another part have assembled belief systems from their periods of time with radical jihadists. But as you say, and I've dealt with Ukraine before. All the conflict in the corruption sort of space and in the organized crime space. And it was regarded as the most corrupt environment in Europe. So to expect that to magically change those corrupt mechanisms, those corrupt systems to evaporate would be very difficult. But the problem we have all of these interventions or assistance missions or whatever the current term of flavor is, we don't look and say, okay, this is the setting, this is what we know, and this is how we manage the risks. Now there are contractors in there in the security element, very, very large ones, and they're obviously earning a great deal of money, and there's certainly training contracts being provided for certain things. But Ukraine, really it wasn't in the same position that Afghanistan was, in need of massive economic transformation at the onset. What Ukraine has consumed is enormous amount of capital and machinery in order to prosecute an invasion, counter invasion, and that will bring in on and of itself. And so when I think the unfortunate thing is probably that now the corruption issue is being addressed. It's sort of late in the actions that are taking place, and by being late in the actions that are taking place, it becomes reactionary, and so anti-corruption becomes almost like a compliance checkbox. And then sometimes the wrong steps will be taken, like you said, where they remove people from certain businesses that they fear of corruption, and they lose capability or capacity because now they're box ticking. Oh, we did this, we took this measure. But so Ukraine is. I think that when we come to the reconstruction phase, that's when we'll really see the corruption come in. Because right now, we're talking about the ongoing counteroffensive or whatever else, and it's a fairly normative military engagement. Whereas Afghanistan was dealing with radicalism, where it had inaccessible parts of the country, and it had a force that was targeting, civilians and political figures and social figures, and not just pure military targets. When we come out of that, that's when I think we're going to see the massive amounts of money for reconstruction, the contracting engine starting again. I mean, I'll even say to Afghanistan, when the Talibs assumes power by means of deposing the previous constitutional government, I watched as the contracting industrial complex began to spin itself up. Everyone was getting ready for contracts. Oh, what are the contracts going to look like? What are the contracts going to look like? The money was pre-allocated, but the Talibs, being as they are, weren't able to mobilize that, or none of that could mobilize, none of that capital, and we would have been again back in this superstructure. So the contracting industrial complex is certainly circling in a predatory fashion, but at the moment it'll be limited largely to relief organizations, and it'll be limited to security organizations, some of whom I'm directly familiar with. At the moment, we start getting back to another thing. We will try to bring out Iraq, thinking we'll bring that, that thinking out of DC and London and what they think Ukraine should look like, or whatever. The Ukrainians with Zelensky seem to be able to steer things more to what they want than take as much pure dictation as GIRoA is forced to endure. With GIRoA was very much, we think you need this, we're going to make the money for this, this is how we want it to be, and then contractors come in. But reconstruction is where it'll be a mess, and that's where I think we'll really see corruption take place, where people will come in and say, oh, I can get this contract, I can do that, I know so-and-so, I'm your man, or people will look to capture wealth where they have privilege of position. Ejaz, you probably would have seen this with contracting in Afghanistan as well. All these big contractors always have a man. I've got my guy so-and-so, in this office, in this place, and they're essentially on the payroll, and their job was always to ensure that the incumbent or whomever got the necessary contract. So you got these sort of people fostered through large amounts of money, whose sole goal was to keep the contracts where he who has the deepest pockets had them.
I remember meeting once I worked with a private security company, and then we had a call up to, I was on the business development and quality systems in the company, and a colleague of mine and I met this guy who came from a company who said they are able to get us contracts, security contracts, and other sorts of contracts, from the U.S. government, if they're given certain percentage. I don't remember the guy's name, but what he said was that he had membership at Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort, and that he would go there and buy someone coffee or something. There was like a huge scheme, and then to get a membership with their organization, we had to pay them a certain amount of money, a certain percentage, and then they will get a certain percentage of the project, like 10 to 15% of the profit, and that profit would be added, factored in the pricing, in the budgeting that you would submit for the proposals. And then the guy was like, I know certain people from the State Department and the U.S. Department of Defense, contracting, U.S. Army Corps of Engineering, and all these organizations always go there, and then we hang out, and then we can talk. And I think that guy knew what he was doing. He knew his business, and that still exists. People go and shake hands, take a coffee, and then find ways to share profits, and that's the war of economy, that I don't know, like the war profiteering. It still happens. I think probably somewhere, if any contractors are involved in Ukraine, I think they will definitely want to, it's very predatory in the cases where you're involved in a country at war with Russia. And I think this also happened in Afghanistan with the NGOs. I have had people, there was one organization that was a UN contractor, and once they were found to be caught with corruption, because I gave them the evidence, the UN came back and said, yeah, we agree, they are corrupt, we're sorry, we're not going to work with them anymore. And I was in touch with the heads of the UN agency. So after a few months, well, not a few months, after a few weeks, actually, I got a call from the contractor itself. And I was like, how did you get my number? So they were, closely in touch. And then they were like, okay, I can give you his number, and then you can go either bribe him or threaten him. So he knew he wouldn't be able to bribe me, but he was able to threaten me. So, so I think that works. I know a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy, or I know a guy that I pay, and he's able to get us contracts.
It's always that phrase we hear, I've got my man.
Exactly. Yeah. I've got my man. Yeah.
And everybody has to have their man, or they'll call him their fixer, to take care of things in these environments. Afghanistan just lends itself, I always called it a corruption enabling environment, because just the amount of money, the way things ran, the processes, and also because you're looking at a situation, often with ministers, they didn't have necessarily a long time in positions of power. So it became a logical choice for them to grab what they can because their future is uncertain. The whole thing, and if that whole cycle, if you wanted to get something done, I remember when I first got there, I like to ask questions. And I was asking, the guy who was my driver, I'm like, hey, did you have to pay a bribe to get your driving license? He's like, yes, I did. I'm like, okay, how did you feel about that? And he's like, oh, it's okay, I got the license. And I'm like, does that bother you or anything? No, it doesn't bother me, because that's how it was done. And we used to have conversations, I used to have to deal with the donor community a lot. And this is what I mean, just, and I see this a lot now, and I say this a lot now with the present state of things, the present decisions by, really everyone, whether that's the IEA or whether that's the West, is, have you thought this through? Because when we look into creating, change, or people talk about a certain concept, have you thought through the secondary and tertiary effects? Have you thought through this in context of the country? Have you thought this in context and rule of law? Because it just doesn't happen. So when corruption was almost normative for people's day to day, because you've got, in corruption, you've got, the corrupt actor, which can be, a cop you're paying a bribe to, or your driving instructor, or it can be, a political figure. And then you've got the second part of the corrupt equation as a person who pays the bribe, or, and for the person paying the bribe, they're doing that because they feel that is necessary to get what they want or what they need, and B, the chance of detection is low.
Mm.
And so if you feel you can get away with it, you're going to do it. If you feel it's going to make a difference to your situation, whether that's, as I say, just something innocuous or paying a bribe at a checkpoint, you want to go from A to B, I've got to go through here, I need to pay this guy, a little bit of money. And it just becomes a cost of doing business in some respects. And changing that dynamic, no one wanted to have serious conversations about it. How do you change the dynamic with a country that's also had to have a survival economy? People have to make money where they can. And there was just really no serious questions were really asked about how you do this, how you change it, or how you improve detection. Because if you can't detect, report, and act, you can't get the anti and counter in corruption. And there was really no mechanisms for, obviously Ejaz did some great stuff on big things, with whistleblowers, but really one of the few. And, I know he had challenges with them that he could talk about. And I know that when I had big cases that threatened the security and integrity of the mission of very important U.S. assets, involve corruption from very big Western contractors. When I punched that into the rule of law machine stateside, I just got the answer. This is so damning. It's basically so big, so damning. We're not going to do anything.
Yeah, I mean, what you shared as an example is the sort of like you pay 2,000 Afghanis. Well, with currently the same process still ongoing. People to get IDs and passports have to pay $1,000, $2,500. I'm sure you've dealt with this situation. With the people you were in touch that you wanted to evacuate from Afghanistan, they had to pay large sums of money to be able to get passports. That's like petty corruption. I've seen U.S. INL, which was a division of DEA, contractor that was called Roots of Peace. You're familiar with the name. They had large multi-million-dollar project, alternative livelihood projects. Basically, they were, spending millions of dollars to bring Afghans into conferences in India to introduce them to the market. Well, you could do that with just $1 million or less than that, but they spent millions hiring people to do this. And then once I saw this guy who was 66 or 67 years old from Germany, who came to Afghanistan on a 1-month visa. The process that you come with a visitor visa, and then to extend your visa, you have to get a work permit. And then if your age is beyond 65, you don't get a work permit, right? And you don't get a visa. This guy, this German guy, hired someone to work as his finance manager or officer. There was this girl, and then this girl had connections with the Afghan government. Basically, she bribed people to get him the work permit and the right papers so that he can get his visa. I got in touch with the people in the government, and they were like, oh yeah, we got calls from places that we had to do this. The director of the organization was roaming around in Afghanistan back in those months because she was lobbying for herself. And this project was initially supposed to be carried out by Ministry of Agriculture. That was led by I forgot his name, by Ministry of Agriculture, and then they were not able to do the project because they didn't have the technical capacity. And then this organization was paid to do the project. Roots of Peace was paid to do the project. Later, what I found was that there was an arrangement, some agreement between the minister and the organization that you don't do this project or some of the directors in the organization, they were given the money, everything by the US government. They didn't do the project. They were just, sitting, doing nothing. So they didn't do it so that this organization, Roots of Peace, gets the project, right? I mean, I'm giving this as an example. There were thousands of these, so that the Afghan government could do the project, could take the lead, hire the people necessary for the program, to be able to implement it. But they didn't. And they waited until the U.S. government, the INL, decided that they want to hand the project to Roots of Peace. The director of the organization came to Afghanistan, and she had several meetings back in those days. And then I found the papers from the project, the evaluation of the project by the Afghan government, that the ministry was not able to do it. And the reason they were not able to do it was because they didn't want to. They wanted the money to go and they probably got their share from the project. But these are, again, small examples of how money was looted from the country. For months and months, I was doing research on how money was taken out of customs. That's where, so these projects you get once or twice, or, just for a few months, but customs is where you get a steady income for years and years, as you want. They created their own one-stop shop for creating like one window or one-stop shop. Like, this is like, if you're creating an organization, like if you're a government and you're providing services, like in Afghanistan, I remember when they were introducing this with the Ministry of Economy and Ministry of Commerce, businesses had to go get their licenses, and then they had to go to several government departments to be able to process, get signatures or process their, licensing. And then they were all brought under one roof. And this was a huge achievement, paid by for millions of dollars they spent on this whole idea of creating a one-stop shop. The corrupt officials in customs created their own one-stop shop for corruption. So I have videos from that. I can share the videos. Basically, like, let's say we work with one of the customs in Afghanistan, like the three of us, and then we have like 12 other people working. A business, like a company that has to import goods, has to go through all of us, and all of us get our share from this person. All of us get our certain amount of money from each good import to the country. Let's say you're bringing iPhones. The description of the iPhone, the person responsible for the description is able to change the description in the system from iPhone to toilet papers, right? So you're not supposed to pay for huge amount of money for taxes for customs for iPhone. You're paying it for toilet paper. And then on each point in the custom, like, you had the descriptions, you had the where if you're importing fuel or gas, you pay, there's descriptions on which type it is, the amount you're importing, and all different types of. So on each point there was someone who got their share from the bribes from this person who was importing. So they said, okay, like, let's choose, like, we are a group of people, and then we choose, for example, Scott to collect all this for all of us. How do I make sure that you got my share from this guy? What you do is put a sign on the paper. I have that video. I don't know if I can share the screen. I'll just find it as we're talking, and then maybe I can share it. So the person will be able to put a sign on the paper, and then at the end of the day, go back to the archives and then put a lighter, and the sign would be gone. So they used a special pen to sign it, and then at the end of the day remove it. This process was very much in all of the in custom points in Afghanistan, and it was hard to catch. But so when Scott gets everyone's share at the end of the day, at the end of the month, most of us either go to Turkey or somewhere like India, or like somewhere where we can share, like Uzbekistan, all these different places where they could get, like if you're closer to the northern Afghanistan, you go to Uzbekistan or Tajikistan, or if you have enough money, you have a visa to Turkey, and you have your house and your residency in Turkey. So basically, an easier point to distribute the money would be Turkey, or Dubai. I'm gonna find the video. It's very interesting. It was shared with me by one of the people I knew at the customs, and
While you're working on figuring that out, and we can for sure share the screen. One of the things that's important to say is the U.S. had this, right? Chester Arthur, who was going to be president one day, one of his treats, one of the things they gave him was he ran the New York Customs House, and so why did he get that? Well, he played with the machine, he agreed with them, and obviously doled out the money that came through the New York Customs House, and so it was a very lucrative thing, right? So this is an age-old process. And so I guess I'll throw this while you're doing that work over there, Ejaz. I'll throw this over to Scott. Does this in any way resonate? If we're going to look at Ukraine as an example, like we're talking about Afghanistan and customs.
Mhm.
This is just one aspect of the economy, right?
Mhm.
Is this at all possible in Ukraine? Like, will we see the same kind of thing where people take a given portion, a given ministry, commerce, economy, customs? Should we expect the same thing?
I mean, I don't. Most likely, yes. I generally make it a rule, sort of just to discuss the things that I know about directly.
For sure. Yeah.
So what I know has occurred is, large amounts of munition obviously comes in, but because of the power that gets created by military success, certain units weren't receiving ammunition, and so they would have to drive back to Kyiv, a 500-kilometer round trip to resupply themselves because they weren't being given the proper resources that they needed to do their part of the conflict.
Right.
So it's in terms of or potentially what's being sold on black market or unaccounted inventory, or how inventory is managed. These are all gaps that can occur. I mean, just as you used the phrase so brilliantly before, that the US becomes a net destabilizer. There is no way that a country that was known for corruption has a perfect hold on keeping corruption out, just because there's this idea of national interest. And obviously that makes it very difficult for them to talk about then, because they don't want to deteriorate their access to munitions or whatever financial support they're receiving. So it's a very complex situation. But I think in many respects, when we know we're dealing with fragile environments or environments that had a tradition for a capacity for corruption, the onus for checks and balances on us, because we know what these situations can precipitate. We understand that the culture has elements of corruption, or the economy was heavily corrupt, and those corrupt mechanisms in terms of how things were accounted for, documented, stamped, signed, just didn't disappear overnight. They will still be there, but the onus is really on the donor in that respect, because you can't transform the way people have done things, the habit of things. So it's I can't see that it wouldn't be, because not like if they had good mechanisms to capture corruption, it wouldn't have been the most corrupt country in Europe. But no doubt those things exist at present. But the onus is on the donor in a lot of respects.
if we widen the scope of all this stuff, there's an organization, a think tank called the Atlantic Council, and they're sort of lead the way, right? And then when you dig into these guys, you realize that they get a nice fat $100+ million check from some United Arab Emirate type folks. Now, I'm not saying UAE, but just Arab Emirates. And next thing you know, the very head of the Atlantic Council is like, guess who would be a great guy to run the UN's environmental program? It's these guys, and they get this really sweet deal. And so you see the money come in and the favor go out the machine. I swear to God, this sounds impossible, but I swear to God, it's true. And I can go pull up the links right now. I'm not going to do it because we're in the middle of this show, but you know this. You see Hillary Clinton, and again, I'm not against the Clintons. I'm just drawing lines here. They come out with their aid organization, or I should say she comes out with her aid organization. They're going to do that. Guess who they're immediately tied to? The Atlantic Council, who gets money from Pinchuk, who's one of the prime oligarchs. And look, there's another oligarch, the richest oligarch of all the oligarchs in Ukraine. These guys give a lot of money to the Atlantic Council, right? And so you look at these things and you say, maybe it's nothing, but doesn't that sure seem like something? And I'm going to go further into this. When you're a politician in any country, you're always fundraising, right? And so if you're alienating your most wealthy people, your business people, aka oligarchs, you're saying you can't participate, we're coming after your resources, you're still going to go to these guys and fundraise, though, because you still need their money to run your campaign, to feed your party so that you can stay in power. And so you have this weird machine where you're trying to keep people at arm's length, but also I have the video. I'm going to set it all up. I got it covered, Joss. So you have all of these things that feed into this, that, one hand is washing the other while the one hand spanks the one. And it's like a really weird thing that Ukraine has. But this is a common thing, I think, for all of these problematic areas where they're trying to get better, but they're so intertwined. And then you bring in a destabilizer like the U.S. or the West, where there is so much money. Look, I would act no differently. If you brought a bunch of contract money into my country, I'd be like, how do I, even if, as an American, like, ooh, how do I get some of that money? How do I earn it? Even if I'm not doing anything illegal, how do I get as close to where that money is as possible, right? Because we're all incented to go have a payday if that money is going to be spent anyhow. So I guess when we look at this in terms of what didn't work and what did work in Afghanistan and what we think might happen in Ukraine, I guess, what are your guys' thoughts when we see all of this intertwined mesh where think tanks are funding potentially bad ideas and the same ideas that haven't worked? And when we see politicians, yes.
We discussed this last night with Dr. Christine Fair, the Tony Blair Institute, and this was something that I saw very, very closely. Was around the Doha Agreement. And so you had Brookings funded out of Qatar, basically handling and writing a lot for the Taliban and creating the idea of 2.0. And so what we get now is think tanks as academic opinion as gun for hire, that will write a specification to persuade an argument or create an opinion. And again, and that to me is damaging to academic pursuit, because academic pursuit is supposed to be the equivalent of scientific method of the study of society or literature or whatever else, empirical based, fact based, working with a problem set, not the creation of an opinion or a narrative. And the super interesting thing that you see today is that, if you read the Brookings narrative in 21, they said Al-Qaeda would never return. Obviously not true. And so the untruths of these things come out. And now you see distancing between Brookings and the Taliban, who they really were integral. We always used to joke that you could tell when they'd come in because something was so well written, and when the Talibs had written something, it was terrible. But today you have that same mechanism, but they're just not as competent. The funniest one as an anecdote is I'd written a paper called Trajectory Analysis, and it was basically looking at how the factionalism in the Taliban and their inability to cooperate would lead to disengagement, and that would likely drive friction or conflict with Hibbatullah and the Haqqanis at some point, because the situation is unsustainable. So that goes through all the UN, UNAMA, all the envoys everywhere. The UN sanctions teams use parts of it. State Department argues a bit against it and then agrees with it on Twitter. And then the reverse paper that comes out was clearly most likely written by Crisis Group, but it plagiarized one of my other papers on social stabilization and social cohesion. And I remember they slid into a DM with me on Twitter, and they were asking about the Constitution, because they just didn't have an understanding of constitutional law or recognition. And so I watched then my work where you talk about what you actually need for a stable society. The top is like, oh, we've got social cohesion. I was like, no, you don't. Whoever did this for you didn't understand the academic principles. Now, if that had been Brookings, it would have been a different thing, because they're smart. But so think tank for hire, opinion for hire in academia is very real. It's used for opinion making, and opinion making to project policy, because then you have credibility. This has come from Rand. This has come from Atlantic. This must be good. But it's not. It's the creation of something malignant. And the role of academia and gun for hire in the selling of 2.0 in Afghanistan absolutely cannot for 1 second be understated. It would never have had the capacity to present the idea and the idea of reform or whatever else, getting in a Haqqani into New York Times, all enabled by that. And so we need distance between these things. America is a great example for lobbying, for getting elected. In Australia, it's not really possible to do that, or it wasn't when I was there. But we need to separate money from political power. If we don't, we'll climate getting hammered. We are where we are because of that lobbying, because of that oppression of opinion. These things are very destructive, and I would call them a corrupt act. If you're willfully misportraying information to create a narrative that benefits somebody, and using the trust and credibility, which is a currency of kind, to persuade people to something against their interests, that is one of the most abhorrent acts of corruption, to convince people to act against their interests in the full knowledge that what you're asking them to do is harmful to them. And that is absolutely true of Afghanistan, and certainly there are truths in it for Ukraine as well.
Ejaz,
Yeah.
what do you think about all this?
I totally agree. Think tanks, researchers, so-called scholars, who've never spent a day in Afghanistan, being hired to write policy papers, research papers, opinion articles, or go to an extent to write an opinion article in New York Times for Anas Haqqani, a well-known terrorist. Back then, people were like, we know who did this. There were a lot of suspects, people who could have been the author of the very infamous New York Times article. And then Anas and his brother are, in the FBI list, most wanted list, and they are also in the UN terror watch list. And then the audacity of the New York Times to publish that. They have blood of thousands of the Afghans in their hands, and there was no mention of that in the article. No disclaimer that this particular person is on the FBI list and in the UN list, and responsible for the death of thousands of innocent Afghan men, women, and children. They brought an ambulance filled with bombs and blew it in front of a hospital. And they killed hundreds of U.S. soldiers and hundreds of NATO forces. And that was published. And why was it published? Maybe because there was, where's the New York Times paid for this? And then there are think tanks, so-called think tanks, who published articles. I remember just before the collapse of the Afghan government, there were tons and tons of articles and tweets coming from scholars, like Ashley Jackson was, she's nowhere to be found anymore, like, where is she? Did she make enough money? um there were other people, Ashley was working for I think war studies at King's College. At some point, I called that war studies at King's College London the Haqqaniya of UK. The Haqqani. that same, our mutual friend Lynn was like, I'm a graduate of that university, that same college. But anyways, it's a lot of other think tanks came up, and recently there are documentaries coming, and there are people who are paid by the Taliban, these famous YouTubers, social media influencers, TikTokers, who go there and make videos about security in Afghanistan. Well, the security was bad because the Taliban were blowing bombs, killing people, and it's still bad. If I know at least about 15 people who are acquaintances, colleagues, friends, who have been, in Taliban prison. I can count them and name them, but because of their own security, I won't be able to name them. Their families are so afraid, to publicize their names on social media. Yes, there are still scholars and researchers. I don't know if you read recently, if you watched the documentary about the Taliban justice system. Maybe they put some, that's not even justice. It's not based on a written code of laws and criminal code or whatever that is. It's just instant justice. If this mullah with a beard decides, I don't know based on what, that this woman or this man should be stoned to death, they're stoned to death. And they've so far carried many, many, many of those, punishments on women. They've, stoned women to death. They have had public executions. And then there's no mention of that even when people are talking about engaging with the Taliban. Like, all of a sudden, people go blind to that fact that they're, implementing the so-called justice system that just, publicly execute someone, and based on what? No law, no criminal code, nothing. And that never goes in any of these opinion articles or research articles or whatever that is they write. It's just because it doesn't serve their purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And this goes, like the public opinion in Afghanistan, those who are anti-Taliban, they are always saying there's, this is funded by the Western governments because they think that the Taliban are their, they have mutual interests in the fight against the ISIS, or, whatever that happens in the region. That's why they're trying to recognize or, whitewash the Taliban. I mean, that's the public opinion. You can't just tell people, no, it's not. They think it's, the West has certain interests in the region, and then the Taliban can be the instruments to serve those interests. And that's why they think the West is funding those, these efforts to whitewash the Taliban.
I have this video ready. You want to watch it and commentate on it?
Sure. Yeah. So, I was working with several people and in the customs, and I asked them, okay, how does this happen? Like, basically, I would let people who were within the organization to explain how corruption was done. I was not a researcher or a scholar or someone with an expertise. I became an expert because they were the experts, because they were giving me the lessons. They were the ones who provided me the information, and they were like, okay, we can tell you how it's done. And then I would just sit with them for hours, and they would talk, and I would listen, and I would take notes, and they would they would give me documents. I would go and, lengths to talk to them and bring them, but for them, it was too hard to trust someone to come and talk to. It was very hard for some people to, just sit with someone and say like, hey, this is how it's done. There were even some people who in the past benefited from corruption themselves. And at some point they were like, okay, this is really bad. I've been doing this for years, and I don't want to do this. And there were some people who had an interest, and then it was, they wanted something, but it was taken by someone else, and they were like, okay, I'm not going to let this go. I'm going to give this person to the police, or to the government, to the law. And I would sit with them and talk to them. And then, even when they gave me documents, and I had no idea what the document meant, because I never worked in a customs point, or in the Ministry of Finance, or I didn't work, for example, with Ministry of Urban Development, with which I had a huge case of ghost school. Scott is very familiar with the case of ghost schools in Afghanistan, paid by the UN, the US government, by the US taxpayers' money. And then those schools never existed. They were just ghost schools and ghost soldiers and all those things. And I would just sit with them. I would be like, okay, explain this. Where is the problem? And then they would explain, and then again and again, until it made sense. And then I would put it in simple words, so that, those who are dealing with this would be able to understand this, and so that they don't have to spend a lot of time to try to find out what's the issue. And I shared most of my findings with I think almost more, like the UK government and the US government had almost all of the findings that I had. I shared it with them. I had meetings with the US Embassy officials, with very senior officials in the US Embassy. At some point they didn't really care, because they knew at some point that Afghanistan was a lost cause. For them, they knew where it was going, and because they had their Doha deal, and they knew that the Taliban were coming, early 2021 and late 2020, they knew the Taliban were on their way to take the capital. And then they were like, okay, yes. And it's just, meaning for this, taking those documents. And at some point I got a few calls, and then, okay, for future lessons, we want to see what happened.
Well, let's see this lesson. Let's roll this thing. And I believe I've stripped the audio out. Let's see what happens here. So this is the document.
So you see the on the bottom left, the two signatures.
Mm-hmm.
The one that looks like a stamp, that's a signature. That's a pen signature. So this is a customs paper that has all the descriptions, the what type of the codes that describes the item, everything basically. And then the guy lights it up. You see, it's gone. That signature was put there for the group, the entire corrupt group, to make sure, so that, don't touch this guy, because I already got what he had to pay, right? So this is their way of creating their own government of corruption, their own one-stop shop for corruption. And this happened in almost every custom point.
Wow.
Yeah. And I can say billions of dollars annually were looted. That's like the money that should go, it was, Afghanistan was enough, would have enough to finance itself from the customs, from the, but no, it was all taken, looted by certain people. who were also, mostly enabled by the West. All these strong men, like in the North, who in the North, Scott.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in every a customs point, someone who was strong at some point, enabled by the U.S. government, enriched by the U.S. I wouldn't say just U.S. government. Like in the North, it was
Germans.
mostly Germans. Yes, Mazar was Germans. And the guy was a strong man at some point. He was a governor, and then he owned everyone and everything. Yeah, so probably if like if we want to get a lesson from Afghanistan, we should, I mean, the West should stop investing in people. They should invest in institutions, and they should invest in indigenous ideas. If it's in Ukraine, it should be Ukrainian ideas, Ukrainian ways. It shouldn't be American or British or Western ideas that they want to implement.
No.
It shouldn't be a proposal written by someone sitting in Washington or in London.
Oh yeah. This is one of the rules that I developed. It was any project or anything we're going to do should be fill in the blank. I'll just say Iraqi inspired, led, and provisioned. And then we just work within that paradigm. How do we help? How do we get out of the way? And that's it. So inspired, led, provisioned. And if they don't want to do it, you don't do it. That's just as simple as that. No matter how desperately you want to do something, you don't do it unless it meets those. And look, if you're the commander or you're the ambassador and like this is your thing, you get to do what you want because you're the boss. But you're doing it. You're breaking the rule by design. And so that's just my input from my experience. We had so many things where we just refused to allow the Afghans, the Iraqis, the Somalis, whoever it was. We just refused to allow them to, just like, hey, how you're the governor. I would go to these different areas and say, hey, we're leaving. Like, no shit, we are leaving. And they're like, yeah, I know you're going to leave. Like, no, you're not getting what I'm saying. We are leaving. 4 to 8 weeks, 12 weeks tops. And their eyes would get real big. They're like, you're really leaving? And I'm like, we are really leaving. What do you need to govern this place? Because we're gone. And they would be like, I'm going to make a list, and because they had no idea, because we were terrible. The U.S. is great at just poof and just disappearing. And we're such great partners. We don't ever tell the partner, hey, we're leaving. Like, no shit, on this date, we're out, right? And we never give anybody idea, like this is how we ramp down so you can ramp up. Because on or about May 1st, we will not be here anymore, and we would never take that care to say, you're going to have to do this on your own in the next however many days. And we have an election coming up here in the U.S., right? We're going to pick a whole new Congress. We're going to pick a new president. And I guarantee that person's going to have a different approach to Ukraine. Probably a different approach to Afghanistan, because we're going to do something different. And they're going to pick different things. It's all going to change. But we never take the time to teach those things. And so you're so right, Ejaz, like that how do we get behind the indigenous way of doing it so that it's provisionable? Because here's what you can't do in Afghanistan. You cannot send a Afghan tax collector to a district that we've grayed out of the map. There is a district in Zabul province we called it Kaki Afghan. We didn't even talk about it. We just erased it because it was too far off the route. The Arghandab district of Zabul, we just didn't talk about it. Too far off the map. Just not even going to discuss it. It didn't exist, right? And so it's like whole areas of the country where we just had no interest in having interest. We just left it alone. No idea what's going on there. Couldn't care about it at all, right? So the same concept applies to Ukraine. Is what's possible here. They have great business people there. Let them run the damn business. Stop teaching them. Stop bringing our social ideas and just get out of the way and figure out where we can augment what's already working. I totally agree with what you're saying. I don't want to take any more of your guys' time, but I do want to let you respond to that, Ejaz.
You said Iraqi owned, Iraqi led. It reminded me of Afghan owned and Afghan led peace process that was on everyone's. Everyone was talking about Afghan owned and Afghan led peace process. If you remember, Scott, nothing that was done in the process was Afghan led and Afghan
None of
owned.
it.
It was all US led or Khalilzad led and Khalilzad owned process. And then at the end, basically what they did was, in the name of Afghan owned and Afghan led, was negotiating with the enemy and giving them the country in a silver platter. Taking everything the Afghan army had and just bringing the Taliban. Like basically, the U.S. gave us away, and not just say, "Okay, we're gonna go." And we're gonna let you guys do whatever you want. No, it's just like, okay, here's Kabul and here's you. We're gonna head out of Bagram overnight, and then boom, everything else, goes away.
Yeah.
And then this is the same. I fear the West is going to negotiate with the Russians and leave Ukraine out. I fear that will happen. And then, well, what was Ukraine doing? Like one day we'll be like, where the hell is Ukraine in these talks and these discussions? And I'm sure it will happen. If it happened with Afghanistan, it will happen with the US, and at some point it will happen with Taiwan. And one day you will see Taiwan being negotiated by the West, and then with the Chinese, and then the country being invaded. Thank you so much, Pete, for having me.
Yeah, it was great to have you on. Scott, anything in closing?
No, I mean, it was a wonderful discussion, and if we had time, I would have suggested that we have a talk about those last days of the fall, as Ejaz and I are in constant contact of that. But seeing what took place, and I echo everything that Ejaz says, is that the U.S. bites off these big situations, and now we have contested truth. Really, there's no longer. I mentioned something today about this on social media, and I was tired at the time, so I didn't express it as well as I could have. But in previous conflicts, the country was behind a conflict like the US or the UK, or in supporting something. And so we have very clear data or consistent narrative coming out on something. We have a rough idea of what's going on. These days, we have no idea, because everything's become so split that the truth of the matter inside a country, inside America or the UK right now, with what's happening in Afghanistan, is split. There's people trying to sell you polar opposite ideas of what is one truth on the ground, and it's just, we will lead to that position of abandonment, because politically, even if a situation were to be morally correct and ethically correct, the partisan natures of things will mean in 4 years' time we pull out, or whenever there's an election, we pull out. When we get somebody new, they have to undo what the other administration did, because they got themselves there arguing polarization. But yeah, most likely there will be a sudden exit from Ukraine, unless, weirdly, I suppose the contracting machine does spin up for reconstruction. And then all the big boys with the money think, oh, money.
I like money.
Yeah. And then that'll bring it back into gear for a period of time, and again, we'll repeat the same mistakes. It's just sort of this very frightening world that we're carrying ourselves, and it's utterly irresponsible, to the glue that holds the world together, which is consistency of behavior, conduct to international rule of law, and to go back to something that you said just very briefly before we jump off, is that when you mentioned before about the oligarchs being the revenue stream, now Biden did something very peculiar. He broke a rule, one, when he went after the Russian central bank reserves and sanctioned them. But when he's sanctioning oligarchs and turning that money over to Ukraine, that's really using a proceeds of crime model. So he's taking it off the Russian oligarchs to finance the Ukraine war, which is a very, very kind of peculiar avenue to take, because I'm not quite sure that that's had reasonable justice process. So Ukraine might well find itself in a peace situation where it's being sued by the Russians for receiving money that was improperly sanctioned. So there's a lot of peculiarity where we might find ourselves. But I absolutely agree with Ejaz. We've learned the US has learned to walk away. Is Pete frozen?
Pete, we don't have your voice.
There we go.
Yeah. No, we don't have your voice still. Maybe it's...
Okay. Now I'm allowed to talk on my own show.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you guys hear me?
Loud and clear now.
Yeah. I love Wi-Fi sometimes. So what I wanted to say was very cagey on the whole thing about the legal process and rule of law. You know, it applies to everybody. And when Ukraine goes in and seizes a Ukrainian businessman's assets, and they go to court and Ukraine loses, you know, it's because that property belongs to that person. Whether or not you think they got it illegally or whatever, there's a process for that too. So when we start ripping people off of things or seizing assets, whether it's the U.S. seizing a Russian businessman's assets, there's a court for that. And yeah, that's going to be a problem because there's going to have to be, just because you're Russian doesn't make you a bad person. And so a guy like Dmitry Mazepan, he was a businessman who dealt in fertilizer and was Belarusian, not even Russian. And he gets booted out of F1 and becomes a pariah and loses a bunch of property. You know, there's going to be there has to be court cases. Like, you kick this person out of all of these things. We had a Russian ballerina kicked out of the ballet. We've gone mad with that stuff. Anyhow, I appreciate you guys coming on the show. I really do. And unless you have anything to say in closing, I'm going to wrap this thing up. Do either of you guys want to say anything else before we go?
No, but just thank you for having us on. I mean, your show is a very good one because you can talk quite freely, about a lot of things, and it's good to have these spaces that are just very open, because we do need to have opportunities to get people to look at things. And I guess I would say in closing is I very much understand a lot of the perspectives that Afghans would have on mistrust for information, mistrust for intention of the West, as Ejaz theorized, about the role of the Taliban and U.S. interests and these sorts of things. because it's such. I can't come to mental terms with it, and I have a deep love of the country and its people, but it's not my country by birth or by nation or by identity. And to see that abandonment, to see being left in this position, looking for answers, you'll try to find them wherever you can because it's so incomprehensible. The tragedy of it is, I don't even think it was that smart. I just think that Trump wanted out, Biden followed it through, and that's what happened. And there isn't
especially in a country where they stone people to death.
Yeah.
You come in with social ideas and social changes. It's just irresponsible to come in with these changes if you're not committed to see it through, to go there. If it's so goddamn important to go out and ensure that women can go to colleges and universities, well, then move your ass there and commit to it. Don't sit there and protest it in the streets of the United States in comfortable ass California. Go do the hard fucking work of going to that country and committing your life to it, because that's what you're asking these ladies to do. And it's bullshit to half-ass, not even quarter-ass, 1/8 ass that project by just caring. You can't carry that stuff into existence. And people are paying still with their lives. And we've made a lot of people's lives miserable by pulling out. We went in, we were there, we should have stayed. So anyhow, Ejaz, anything else at all for you, Ejaz?
Thank you for having me, Pete. And it's always great, as Scott said, to be able to freely talk, to share whatever you want. And looking forward to having more such discussions. And it's always happy to see you and chat with you, Scott.
Likewise.
Stand by, fellas. I'll be right back.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours